Many of you have asked me to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. Now, I don't know how many of you watching this video have really paid attention to what's really been going on around the world. So today, I'm doing this video basically to lay out kind of the groundwork, the history of what's really happening. Because you've heard a lot of different news in the Western media. A lot of it, most of it, if not all of it, misinformation, half truths, not true at all. So the professor is going to lay out the groundwork for you. Now, when the Berlin Wall came down in early 1990s, okay, the American government and the Soviet Union at the time, okay, made a deal. And the deal was very simple, that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which comprised of 30 countries, are not going to expand beyond East Germany. What that means is the Russians, of course, were concerned that of encirclement by NATO countries. So they agreed that wasn't going to happen. So for several years, NATO did not expand beyond East Germany. However, in 1996, for the first time, okay, there was a man by the name of Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz, a former president of the World Bank, he was an official at the State Department, wrote a memorandum. In his memorandum, he basically advocated that the United States should be the only big dogs in town, and that the United States should not allow any country whatsoever to challenge it in the world stage. So based on that memorandum, the US government decided that NATO should expand eastward, okay? So that certainly was a violation of the agreement. When the Russian actually mentioned the agreement, the United States told the Russian that, number one, the agreement was with the Soviet Union, which you know that Soviet Union no longer existed, that the agreement was not necessarily with Russia. So they expanded. First, they had Poland, Lithuania as part of NATO. No problem. The Russian protested. In 2004, under George Bush Jr., NATO again expanded eastward to include Latvia and some other country, former Soviet Republic. Now, you would remember that in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, the country of Georgia. And the reason they did was because the Georgians thought that they wanted to be part of NATO. Now, you may ask yourself, why is it that Russia concerned so much about who become members of NATO? And I will tell you why. NATO is a military alliance, okay? It's a military alliance that the Russians see as an enemy, as a threat to them. So they do not want countries that share borders with them to be members of NATO. Why, you ask? Well, here's the reason. NATO, as I've said, is a military alliance, number one. Number two, in the treaty, okay, Article 5 of the NATO treaty made it very, very clear that if another country attacks a NATO country, you attack one, you attack all. So which means that if a country that shares borders with Russia becomes a member of NATO, if there is a confrontation between that country and Russia, technically NATO is in war with Russia. Now, you know, some of the NATO countries, not all of them, have nuclear weapons. So the Russians are very concerned of having NATO in their backyard. Now, when you hear about what's going on in Ukraine and you listen to the news media, to the Western media, no one is talking about the reason for the war. All they're saying is, well, Russia is being aggressive, Russia is doing this, Russia is doing that. No one is addressing Russia's security concern. Now, imagine if the Russians had decided that they wanted to set, they wanted to set a military station somewhere in Canada or somewhere in Mexico near the Texas border, okay? Will the United States then say it's okay for the Russians to have a military alliance that is so close to their border? Now, I want to take you back to history. In 1962, the world almost went to war, to a third world war. Why, you ask? Because the Soviet Union at the time decided that they wanted to put ballistic missile in Cuba. And when the Kennedy administration found out what was going on, they objected fiercely. I mean, this was something that the United States was prepared and ready to go to war with the Soviet Union. So at the time, the United States made a deal with the Soviet Union. And the deal was, which nobody knew until many years later, what deal Kennedy made with Khrushchev. So the deal that Kennedy made with Khrushchev was that in exchange for removing the missile in Turkey, okay, which certainly in the neighborhoods of Soviet Union at the time, that the Russians would take back the missile that they were about to be placed in Cuba. So for many, many years, there has been this understanding that each powerful country, the United States and Russia, will stay within their sphere of influence. They would not challenge each other in the sphere of influence. Now, if you look at the world map, okay, all the countries that were part of former Soviet Union, they're all now independent countries. But if you listen to Western media, they will tell you that, well, the Soviet Union came apart, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't really what happened. The president of Ukraine at the time, Russia, and the Soviet Union, okay, decided that it was better for the Soviet Union to break apart, to be no more. But it wasn't the West who actually forced the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union broke up because those three presidents got together and had a meeting back in 1991 and decided that, hey, it is better for us to do that. So Ukraine, all of these countries now were part of the Soviet Union. So now let's go back to the war in Ukraine, okay? Ukraine is a very strategic country as far as Russia is concerned, because Ukraine has borders with the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, which are strategic places for Russia. Now, Russia has been saying for years now, they have been complaining for years, and this is not the first time. Russia has been complaining back since 1996 about NATO's expansion eastward, but no one in Washington is paying attention. No one in Paris is paying attention. No one in Germany is paying attention. So this war in Ukraine, NATO is the reason why we're having this war in Ukraine, pure and simple, pure and simple. Now, here's what's interesting. The NATO, Ukraine wants to be a member of NATO. Now, remember in 2014, the Russians took over Crimea. They basically went to war, annexed that part of Crimea. Now, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was working really hard trying to get Ukraine into NATO, to become a member of NATO. Now, under the Trump administration, obviously, Putin didn't really need to invade or to fight a war in Ukraine because Donald Trump understood the power of Russia, and Donald Trump understood, for whatever it's worth, whether you agree with Donald Trump, not agree with Donald Trump, that's not the issue. The issue is Donald Trump is very realistic. He knows fully well that it's better to have a friendship with Russia than to try to antagonize Russia, because there's no winning a war with Russia. I don't care what you hear in the Western media about the performance of Russian military in Ukraine. War is a nasty business. If there was a confrontation, a head-to-head confrontation between the United States and Russia, and I'm telling you, there's not going to be a winner on that war. Everyone will be dead, period. It's not something that could happen. So the Putin calculation was that if he allows Ukraine to become a member of NATO. Undoubtedly, NATO would actually place tactical nuclear weapon within the border, within the country of Ukraine, which will represent a threat to Russia. So it's either Russia fight a war now before Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, or Russia fights the war later. But either way, there's going to be a war because NATO keep expanding, pushing. Now, here's the interesting thing. In 2008, Putin said, look, why don't Russia become a member of NATO? Because, you know, you've talked about a military alliance, and that was designed to prevent Soviet aggression. And this is back after the Second World War. The Western countries, including the United States and Canada, were concerned about Soviet aggression. So they come together as a group and say, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. That really was the point of NATO. Now, since Soviet Union no longer exists, so there's really no reason for NATO. I mean, who is NATO trying to fight? So when Russia, when Vladimir Putin asked to be a member of NATO, the United States shut it down. They said, no, we don't want you here. We don't want you to be part of NATO. So if you are Vladimir Putin, so what do you say? What question do you ask? You say, look, listen, there is a military alliance, a European military alliance. It's very clear that Russia is in Europe. And if Russia cannot be part of that military alliance, certainly Russia was part of G7, G20, all the different organizations, Russia's always been part of it. So if Russia cannot be part of NATO, then the question is, who is NATO targeting? What's the reason for having NATO anyway? Okay, why? So the Russian understand, the Russian people understand, and the Russian government understand that NATO is a threat to them. So you can say whatever you want, but if the table was reversed, in other words, if it was a Russian organization where Russia is seeking to have members, countries that borders the United States as member of the Russian organization. For example, at one time, and you guys probably remember this, there was the Warsaw Pact. Well, Warsaw Pact was an organization of Eastern European countries, kind of similar to NATO. And the idea was that they wanted to join forces together in case somebody attacked them. So of course, once the Soviet Union disintegrated, Warsaw also disintegrated with it. So assuming, for example, that Warsaw was a real thing, and the Russians now decided that they're going to go, I don't know, to South America, Mexico, Canada, or Cuba, and to set the military things in these countries. Would the United States just sit by and say, well, you know, Cuba has the right to become members of any organization that he wants, or Mexico has the right to become member of organization that he wants? No, that would not. That would not happen. And the United States will see that expansion as a threat to its own security. So you can't possibly say that somehow the Russians are being unreasonable or somehow it's an aggression. It's not. If it is an aggression, it is an aggression brought about by NATO. If it is an aggression, it is an aggression that that could have been prevented because they knew, the CIA knew, they knew that there will be a war because this is not something that just happened now. This is a war that has been planning for a very long time. And I would tell you that back in 2014, 2013, you would remember that there was some kind of a revolution in Ukraine where the president of Ukraine was deposed and was basically pushed, was actually an exile to Russia. That public manifestation, so to speak, or that public force was certainly sponsored by whom, was sponsored by the American government, the CIA. There's been report that the CIA was involved in making sure that the president of Ukraine at the time in 2013, 2014 was a puppet of the Russian. That's what they said. And they deposed him. And of course, They had elections, Poroshenko became president, and then Zelensky, and then this war. Now, here's what's going on. This war in Ukraine is going to go on for a while. And I want to, let me just clarify a few things. When the war started, I've read some of Western report on the war, and they said, well, the Russian military hasn't performed very well. The Russian military, that the Russia had failed because Russia wanted to take over Ukraine. Russia wanted to take over Kiev and so on. Total nonsense, total nonsense. Russia never wanted to take over the country itself. Russia wanted to make sure that Ukraine understand that there's a price to pay if they want to bring what Russia considered an enemy, because Ukraine has a long border with Russia. And you can't fault Russia for worrying about its own security. So when the war started, what the Russians did is basically get rid of all the air defense system of Ukraine, get rid of the Air Force, basically destroy all the airplanes so that they could continue their operation without much challenge, which is what the Americans did when they went to Iraq or Afghanistan. This is not something novel. It's really the way you fight wars. So of course, the Western media is not reporting the war fairly. And I'm very surprised that now that they actually admitted that the Russians have made progress in the Donbass and the east and the south of Ukraine, because remember, the Russians are taking over Crimea, and they wanted to protect that area for strategic reason because of access to the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. So now that the Russians are basically taking control of the entire Donbass, and they want to keep control of that area. In order for them to control of that area, they have to make sure that the Ukrainian cannot challenge it. Now, here's the funny thing, right? When the war started back in February, okay, if NATO wanted to make peace, the first thing they would have to do is say, hey, hold on, hold up. We don't have to go to a full-fledged war. Let's stop this. Let's sit down and talk how we can resolve this, okay? And remember that the Russians had some demands, and the demands were a number. First, they don't want Ukraine to join NATO. They want Ukraine to be a neutral country. In other words, they don't want Ukraine to be to have alliances with any. In fact, they don't have a problem if Ukraine become a member of the UE. That's not a problem. The problem is that they don't want Ukraine to become a member of NATO, because that would mean NATO military assets in Russians near Russia's territory. So that's the first thing. They want Ukraine to be neutral. They want Ukraine to admit or accept the fact that the Crimea is actually Russian territory. Those are the two big things that they wanted. So at the time, NATO basically pushed against any type of negotiation with Russia. In fact, if you remember that the Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, was saying that they want to weaken Russia, they want to make sure that that doesn't happen again, and so on and so forth, which was total nonsense. I have no idea what the guy was talking about. For a guy who seemingly seemed to have some kind of understanding of what's going on, he doesn't seem to understand Russian history, he doesn't seem to understand what's going on. But I can tell you that what they say in public is very, very different from what they said in private. So when I read the Secretary of the U.S. Secretary of Defense statement, I thought it was total nonsense. You know, it was just bullshit, really. So the Americans said, no, we don't want to talk. We want to continue the war. So back in March, the United States and other NATO countries start providing Ukraine with weapons, which is certainly has the potential not only to prolong the war, but to create, you know, there could be any mistake and some other country may get involved. So anyway, the Americans have been arming Ukraine, okay? They have been arming Ukraine, and the Russians have certainly objected to that and made it very clear that this is not going to resolve the issue, is going to prolong the issue, okay? So when you hear the United States or the President Biden or people talking about the Putin gas tax and They're talking about inflation. They're talking about what Russia is doing. Well, here's the thing, though. Solve it. That's my question to them. Try to come up with a solution. So now that Russia is actually winning and taking over eastern and southern part of Ukraine, Putin obviously doesn't want to sit down, and you can blame the man for not wanting to sit down. When he wanted to speak, nobody wanted to speak. So now he doesn't want to speak. He wants to continue his special military operation, as he had said all along that this was not an invasion. I mean, of course it is, but the Russian has different views and different way of describing things. They think it is not an invasion. It is actually a special military operation. So what is really causing all this hoopla, especially when we come to economy? Once that happened, once the war started, NATO and the United States decided that they were going to levy sanctions against Russia. And the first thing they did is they took Russia out of the SWIFT system, which is a platform that allow, financial exchanges between countries. So they took Russia out of that. Then they decided that they were going to put sanctions against certain people in Russia, people that are connected to the president or to the government. And some of them are billionaires, oligarchs, they call them. They're trying to seize their property, which is a whole different situation. Okay, that's like a whole different legal issue. I don't know how you can seize somebody's, property without some kind of due process of law, but that we could talk about another time. In any event, once that happened, the European Union started to talk about a way to stop relying on Russian gas. So Germany, as you know, is a country that relies heavily in Russian gas. And as the largest economy in Europe, they need Russian energy, they need Russian gas. So it would take them, 5 to 7 years to kind of find replacement and kind of try alternative sources for energy. So in any event, the European Union decided that once they're gonna place a gas embargo, so no one is to purchase Russian gas. And now the United States are pressuring the European Union to not buy gold from Russia, because Russia earns about $19 billion a year from gold. And the European Union and the United States say they don't want to do that. Now, here's the situation, guys. When it comes to economic sanction, you cannot levy economic sanction against a country like Russia, who is a big producer of oil and other necessities, other things that people want, and not thinking that that's going to affect you. Of course, it's going to affect you. Now, what does that mean? An embargo on Russian gas and Russian oil means that whatever the Russians are producing or were producing and selling to the Europeans, they're going to have to replace it. They're going to have to find another way to buy it, because that's not going to be available in the market. So when you have high demand and less resources, that always increase the price. So if you don't have Russian producing oil and the Europeans are not able to buy that oil, they're going to have to find it somewhere else. And which means that, let's say they have to get it from Venezuela. So Venezuela has other buyers. So which means that if Venezuela have 6, 7 buyers who want the same thing, what do you think Venezuela is going to do? Venezuela is going to say, hey, listen, all of you want it, guess what, my price just went up. So the idea of a price hike, everybody knew that, at least I would assume that the people in Washington are not that stupid or that dumb not to know. My concern is that when they're on television telling people, I just shake my head, because I know that they're lying. I know that they're full of shit. I know that they know the truth. They're not telling the Americans the truth. So this problem that we have is not a Russian problem. I mean, by all extent of the imagination, it is not. This is something that was preventable. This is something that could have been avoided. The Americans could have avoided it because they knew back in 2004 that the Russians will not accept Ukraine as a member of NATO. They know that because within themselves in private, they talk about it, because they, the Americans, would have done the exact same thing if the Russians wanted to move to Mexico or Cuba and just, have their military or their nuclear weapons there. Certainly, they would certainly definitely do that. Now, just to bring you up to date with everything that's been happening. So once the war started in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden, as you know, Finland has a long border with Russia. It's about 810 miles border in the north. Finland certainly is an important country because they share a long border with Russia. Both Finland and Sweden decided, oh yeah, we are afraid of what's going on in Ukraine. We now want to join NATO. And of course, Vladimir Putin said, look, if you two of you join NATO, there's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem. I don't know what's going to happen, but the Russians reserve the right to react to that. But guess what happened? The Russians didn't really have to do that because Turkey has done it for them. The Turkish President Erdogan has had problem with both Finland and Sweden because Turkish president has some concern. And as a member of NATO, okay, there are 30 members inside the NATO alliance, and each member has a veto power over new admission, over new new applicants. So Turkey had used its veto power to object to the inclusion of Finland and Sweden into NATO. So certainly this is something that somewhat wasn't expected by the United States or by the rest of the European Union. They thought this was going to be something that they could do in a month time. In fact, I have read report from the French news, from American news saying, oh yeah, Finland and Sweden are going to be part of NATO. And then Turkish president comes up and say, hey, no, not so fast. We ain't going to do that. So now the Prime Minister of Sweden and the Prime Minister of Finland are forced to address the issues between Finland, Sweden, and Turkey. And the issue is very simple. There are certain people that Turkish President Erdogan sees as enemies, and he called them terrorists. And those people, some of them, are inside Finland, some of them are in Sweden, and these countries before have never tried to work out with the Turkish government to resolve that issue. So both Turkey and Finland are not going to be part of NATO anytime soon. Now, the war in Ukraine just entered its 5th month, okay? This started in February 24th, so now we are February, March, April, May, June, so enter its 5th month. And I don't see an end to this war. And I will tell you why I don't see an end to this war. The war in Ukraine, okay, actually turned into a proxy war between NATO, the United States, and Russia. NATO and the US, have been arming Ukraine. And for as long as they keep sending weapons to Ukraine, then the war will continue. It would continue. So we have to look forward to, to a long war. And I think that the American economy, it's seeing its worst inflation now. It's worst inflationary period. And I think that we're going to have some really hard time next year because we're going to move. If this thing doesn't come to an end, which I don't see how the war in Ukraine will come to an end. I don't see how that's going to happen because the territory that the Russians have already have control of, they're not going to give up this territory and they're going to fight hard to keep it. The United States is not helping solving the issue. In fact, if anything, the US is actually putting oil into the fire. That's what they're doing. That's what NATO is doing. Because they believe that if Putin won, that this would be a bad example for the world, and then this can certainly embolden Putin to invade other countries, which is another bullshit. Okay, it's absolute nonsense. And Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, said that doing a meeting at G7, that it would be it would be a terrible, terrible, terrible thing if Russia were, to win. That's what he says. But my question to Boris Johnson is this: look, what reason, why did Russia invade Ukraine? Very simple. It's very simple. It's because NATO keep poking the bear. It's because NATO keep inviting former Soviet Republic to be part of NATO. That's really the reason. No matter what they tell you, I'm telling you, sorry, that is the reason. Okay. So the question becomes, how do we end this war? Especially when the U.S. is keep arming Ukraine, and now the U.S. is going to provide Ukraine with an air surface missile defense system to kind of help Ukraine a little bit. So the Russians are going to respond. The Russians are going to continue to respond. And I don't like war. I don't think anyone should be happy or celebrate war. I mean, war is terrible. I mean, people die, innocent people die, children, the economy, it's really bad. But some wars are preventable, and the war in Ukraine, to a large extent, was preventable. So the question is, the United States and its NATO allies are responsible for what's going on in Ukraine. You can agree or disagree, but the facts are the fact. We don't get to choose the fact. The fact is that NATO has been doing something that it promised that he wouldn't do. So the Russians have every right to be concerned about being encircled by an enemy force. They have every right to defend themselves. And they see NATO's inclusions of Ukraine or Georgia or any of the countries that share borders with Russia as an existential threat. In other words, they're saying we can fight now or we can fight later. Fighting now is better because we throw the first punch. Fighting later would be harder because then Ukraine and the NATO and its NATO and NATO certainly would have been established and would have created more problems. My concern is that the world had become more insecure. Europe is more insecure now than it has never been since World War II. And the reason why the world is insecure, it's because of NATO, an organization that has outlived its significance and its importance, because quite frankly, we don't need NATO. I think NATO has been very aggressively pursuing these countries for the purpose of creating security issues for the Russians. So I'm not in support of anybody. I'm not saying that the Russians are right for starting the war. All I'm saying to you, all I'm giving you is the facts as they are, instead of what the Western media has been feeding you. I'm telling you the facts. And the facts are what I said, that NATO is the cause of the war in Ukraine. Because as NATO, observes the agreement that they signed with Gorbachev back in 1991 in Bonn, Germany, then we wouldn't be here, because NATO would keep its membership as it was, east of Germany, and not expand beyond that. So they know that when they started to expand beyond East Germany, that they were going to get a pushback from the Russians. And the Russians for years, for over 25 years, the Russians have been complaining about NATO's expansion. But no one is listening. No one is paying attention. No one is showing respect to a country that has thousands of nuclear warheads and that has an hypersonic nuclear missile that the United States of America has no defense against. So this is a very, very serious matter. And to the extent that the US and the NATO countries are just talking rubbish, to me, it's a whole bunch of rubbish. The best thing to do is to find a way for the world to live together. Now, before I close, I want to tell you something that Xi Jinping, the president of China, said during a meeting with BRICS nation. And what he said was that anytime one country thinks that they can control the world, they can dictate what other people do, there will be more insecurity. The way to make sure that the world is secure is to respect each other, to respect each other's need for security and understanding, as opposed to try to be the big dogs. And I think that Xi Jinping was talking to Joe Biden when Joe Biden said a week earlier that the United States should deal with China from the point of view of great strength, which I think is absolute nonsense. Now, this is my first video on the Ukrainian war and the war in Ukraine. And I hope that I have explained to you the history behind what's going on right now and the players and the people who have been involved in what they have done and where we are now. So in my next video, I will talk a little bit about what I consider could be the next military confrontation, and that probably would be with China, either over Taiwan or over the South China Sea. I would explain to you the history of the South China Sea and, of course, the history of Taiwan, the history of the One China policy. All of those are issues that certainly we will talk about. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe and please do share the link with your friends and family. This channel is dedicated to providing you with information and analysis of what's going on, but always based on facts, always based on facts. So if you watch this channel, you're going to know what's going on around the world. So again, thank you for watching, and please subscribe and please do share the link with your friend and family. Thank you.